Single dad met a chef who couldn't taste food anymore. Then his child changed her forever. The first thing she throws away every morning is breakfast. Not because she isn't hungry, because a chef who cannot taste is like a painter who cannot see. And she would rather starve on canned beans than sit at a table that reminds her of everything she used to be. For 2 years, the kitchen stayed dark, the stoves cold, the knives untouched in their block. 17 Michelin-trained staff fired one by one, not because they were incompetent, because she couldn't stand watching other people do the one thing she could no longer do herself. Then one Tuesday morning, a truck rattles through the gate she forgot to lock. A man steps out, quiet, keeps his head down, asks no questions. Behind him, a 7-year-old girl jumps down from the passenger seat, clutching a clay pot with both hands like it contains something alive. It does. A single tomato plant, crooked stem, 3 leaves. She tells the man to stay in the garden. She tells the girl to stay quiet. She goes back inside and opens another can. Along the back wall of the kitchen, a row of hooks holds 17 aprons. All of them still hanging. None of them moved. 3 days later, the girl walks straight into her kitchen, uninvited. In her hands, 1 tomato. Small, cracked, honestly, kind of ugly. And then the girl says something so strange, so completely unexpected, that for the first time in 2 years, the chef reaches out and actually touches an ingredient. What did a 7-year-old say that broke through 2 years of silence? And why did it hit harder than anything a doctor, a therapist, or a former colleague ever could? Like and subscribe if you want to find out, because this story goes places I promise you are not expecting. And the next scene in that kitchen will absolutely wreck you. The truck arrived on a Thursday, which nobody had been expecting. It came up the long gravel drive slowly, the way vehicles do when the person driving them isn't entirely sure they've made the right decision. Pausing at the gate, idling for a moment longer than necessary, as though the engine itself was asking one last time if this was really where they meant to go. Then it continued through. The estate had been many things before it became nothing. A working vineyard, once. A restaurant that people drove hours to reach. A place that appeared in the kind of magazines that get saved rather than recycled. Now it was overgrown and quiet in the particular way of places that have stopped pretending. The vines unpruned, the herb beds choked with weeds, the greenhouse at the far end of the property standing with 3 of its glass panels missing, patched over with something that wasn't glass. The man who climbed out of the truck was in his late 30s. Tall, unhurried in his movements, with the kind of stillness that isn't laziness, but rather the accumulated habit of someone who has spent years working with things that grow on their own schedule and cannot be rushed. He wore no watch. His boots were already dirty before he'd taken 3 steps on the property, which suggested he'd been working somewhere else before this, or that he simply didn't think about his boots. He lifted a child down from the passenger seat, a girl, 7 years old, who had been asleep against the window and woke up without complaint, blinking at the estate with the uncomplicated curiosity of someone encountering something new and finding it interesting rather than threatening. She was holding a small clay pot with both hands, a seedling of some kind, fragile and pale green, which she had apparently been protecting against her chest for the entire journey. He set down his bag. He looked at the estate for a long moment. Then he pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, checked the address one more time, and walked toward the main house. He had not come here looking for anything in particular. That was the truth of it, and it was a truth he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet, though it sat somewhere in him like a stone in still water. Present, affecting the surface in ways that were invisible unless you knew to look for them. His wife had been gone for 14 months. He had stayed in the city for 11 of those months, moving through the apartment, the office, the park where she used to walk in the evenings, with the patient, exhausted diligence of someone completing tasks on a list that no one had actually written down. He fed his daughter. He answered emails. He went to the places he was supposed to go and said the things that were expected of him, and came home each evening to a space that was the correct shape, but the wrong temperature, somehow. too quiet in the wrong places, too loud in the ones where quiet would have been a relief. He had stopped growing tulips 11 months ago. They had been her favorite. He had grown them in the small balcony garden every spring for 9 years, and the year after she died, he had planted them exactly as he always had, tended them exactly as he always had, and when they had bloomed in April, he had stood on the balcony for a very long time before going back inside and closing the door. He had not gone back out. Eventually, a neighbor had watered them until they finished, and he had said thank you when she mentioned it, and that was the end of the tulips. The job listing had been straightforward: estate in need of restoration, botanical expertise preferred, accommodation provided. He had applied without particularly expecting a response, and when the response came, he had packed within the week, because the alternative was to continue doing what he had been doing, which was, as he was beginning to understand, simply standing very still in the middle of a life that had already moved on without him. His daughter had packed her own bag. She had put in 3 changes of clothes, her sketchbook, a handful of seed packets she'd taken from his desk, and the clay pot with the seedling. He had not questioned any of it. She met him at the door. He had knocked twice, and the door had opened before the second knock finished, which told him she had been watching his approach from somewhere inside. She was wearing a dark sweater despite the warmth of the afternoon. Her posture was the posture of someone who had once held a kitchen of 20 people in perfect calibrated tension and had never entirely stopped standing, as though she might need to issue a correction at any moment. She looked at him, then at the child, then back at him. She did not introduce herself. She said, "The garden is in the east wing. The tools are in the shed behind the greenhouse. Accommodation is the cottage at the north end of the property." She said, "The child does not make noise near the main house." She said, "Nobody enters the kitchen." She said these things in the same flat, unhurried tone that a person uses to read the terms of a contract to someone they don't expect to stay long enough for the terms to matter. He listened to all of it without expression. He nodded when she finished. She looked at him for one more moment, the look of someone cross-referencing what they'd been told against what they were seeing, and then she turned and went back inside and closed the door. He stood on the step for a second. Then he looked down at his daughter, who was looking up at him with an expression of serene interest, still holding her pot. He picked up his bag. They walked toward the cottage. On the way, he passed the kitchen garden, or what remained of it. The beds were disordered, half planted, half abandoned, with the particular look of something that had been started by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and then simply stopped. He crouched down beside the nearest bed and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. It was good soil, dark and dense with the right kind of moisture. Whatever had died here, it hadn't been the earth. He noted it. Filed it away the way he filed everything, not as a problem to solve immediately, but as information that would become useful at the right moment. His daughter crouched beside him and pressed her fingers into the dirt too, independently and without instruction, studying the texture with the same focused attention. She looked at him, he looked at her. "Tomorrow," he said. She nodded. They went to find the cottage. It took 4 days for it to begin. He had spent those 4 days working quietly and without interference, assessing the garden systematically, section by section, noting what had died and what had merely gone dormant, and what was surviving against the odds through sheer botanical stubbornness. The rosemary hedge along the southern wall was in better shape than anything else on the property. It had been left entirely alone and had accordingly done what rosemary does when left alone. It had grown large and dense and slightly wild, and it was currently doing significant work keeping the aphid population away from everything else in its vicinity. On the 4th morning, she appeared at the edge of the garden. He did not look up immediately. He was on his knees beside a bed of struggling thyme, working carefully around the root system with a hand trowel, and the work deserved his attention. When he did look up, she was standing with her arms folded and her eyes on the rosemary hedge with an expression that was not quite distaste, but was in the same family. She said, "Pull it out." He sat back on his heels. He looked at the hedge, then at her. He asked her to repeat herself, not because he hadn't heard, but because he wanted to be certain he'd understood correctly. She said it again. The rosemary, all of it. She wanted it removed. He told her, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, that the rosemary was currently functioning as a natural pest barrier for approximately 200 square feet of recoverable growing space, that removing it now would expose the recovering beds to infestation within 2 to 3 weeks, that it would undo most of what the past 4 days had accomplished. She looked at him. Her expression did not change. She said she didn't care. She said she disliked the smell. He put down the trowel. He stood up, and he said, not loudly, not with heat, just clearly, that he repaired things that had stopped working. He did not dismantle them to accommodate a mood. The silence that followed had a particular quality. He had said something true, and she knew it was true, and they were both standing in that truth now, with nowhere comfortable to go. She picked up a small ceramic jar from the garden ledge beside her, one that had been sitting there long enough to gather grime, left behind from some earlier iteration of this place, and she threw it against the flagstone. It shattered with a sharp, definitive sound that scattered fragments across the path between them. He looked at the broken pieces. Then he walked to the shed, found the broom, came back, and swept them up. He did it completely and without any performance of patience, just the straightforward act of cleaning up something that needed to be cleaned. When he was finished, he set the broom against the wall and went back to his time bed and picked up the trowel. She stood there for a moment longer. He could feel her standing there. Then she went back inside. The rosemary stayed. She was more careful the second time. That was the thing he realized 3 days later. The first time had been a test of his nerves, his willingness to be difficult, his basic threshold for being managed. This time she had done something colder. She had paid attention. He was working in the late afternoon, the soft low light of early autumn settling across the garden beds, his daughter nearby with her sketchbook open across her knees, drawing something with the complete absorption that children bring to things they've decided matter. He was not thinking about anything in particular, just working. The particular relief of hands in soil, the quiet machinery of a body doing something it knew how to do. She came out of the side door, not the main entrance this time. Came and stood close enough that he looked up. She said what she said without preamble, without warmth, in the same flat declarative voice she used for everything. She said she knew he was widowed. She said he had come here because he couldn't manage his real life and needed somewhere to hide from it. She said she had no use for a groundskeeper who was using her property as a refuge from his own failures. She said this while he was looking at the bed his daughter had been helping him tend all week. He went very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of someone absorbing a blow that had been aimed accurately and had landed where it was intended to land. She had found the true thing, the thing he had not said aloud to anyone, barely said to himself, and she had said it in a garden in the late afternoon with his daughter 12 feet away. He stood there with the trowel in his hand, and he didn't move for a long time. He knew she was right. Not entirely right, the way anyone is not entirely right about another person, but right enough. He had come here because the city had become a place where every surface reflected something he wasn't ready to look at yet. He had come here because his daughter needed to see him functioning, and functioning in the city had started to require more than he had left. He had come here because he needed to stand in soil and do something real until he remembered who he was without her. He set the trowel down. He did not look at the woman across the garden from him. He reached into the bed and continued working, fingers finding the root system of a stubborn weed, working it loose with the patient, careful attention the job required. He did not leave. He heard her go still behind him, a different quality of silence than before, the silence of someone recalibrating. She had used this before, he understood, said the accurate, devastating thing, and watched people decide they'd rather walk away than stand inside the truth of it. It was a highly effective way to remain alone. He kept working. After a moment, she went back inside. His daughter looked up from her sketchbook. She had heard all of it. He knew she had, because she heard everything, because she was her mother's child, and her mother had heard everything too. She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she was deciding whether to ask a question or simply hold it. She held it. She looked back down at her sketchbook and kept drawing. He exhaled slowly. The evening light moved across the garden. Somewhere in the greenhouse, something was growing that hadn't been growing a week ago. He'd checked that morning, a small green persistence pushing up through the dark. He stayed until the light was gone. The girl had been watching her for 11 days before she did anything about it. It wasn't surveillance exactly, not the calculating kind. It was the particular attention of a child who has learned, through no formal instruction, that the most interesting things happen at the edges of rooms, in the spaces between what people say and what they actually mean. She had inherited this from her father without knowing she'd inherited it. She simply noticed things, the way some children notice things, with the whole open instrument of herself rather than just her eyes. She noticed that the woman never opened the kitchen windows, even on the warmest afternoons. She noticed that the lights in the main house came on very late and went off very early, which suggested a person who spent the dark hours awake and the light ones in a kind of suspended waiting. She noticed that the bins beside the service entrance were full, every single week, of the same small cylindrical cans, the kind with the pull-tab lids, the kind that contain things requiring no preparation, no heat, no decision more complex than which end to open first. She did not tell her father what she had noticed. She understood, without being able to articulate it, that some things you hold quietly until you know what to do with them. On a Tuesday afternoon, while her father was replacing the damaged panels at the far end of the greenhouse and was therefore occupied and some distance away, she picked the best tomato from the vine he had replanted along the south-facing wall 3 weeks earlier. It wasn't beautiful. It was lopsided and slightly cracked along one side where it had grown faster than its skin could keep up with, and it was a deep, almost aggressive red that suggested it had been waiting on that vine for exactly as long as it needed and not a moment less. She carried it to the kitchen door with both hands. She knocked once. She did not wait for an invitation. The door was unlocked. She had tested it twice before, in the way that children test things, not to intrude, but to understand the geography of a place, and she pushed it open and stepped inside. The kitchen was enormous and cold and wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to understand it. The kitchen was impeccably clean. Not the clean of a place that gets used and washed, but the clean of a place that has been sealed. The surfaces were bare. The copper pots that hung along the far wall had the dull, slightly muted sheen of things that haven't been touched in a long time. There was a smell that wasn't a smell, which she would later describe to her father as the way a jar smells after you empty it and close the lid again. The woman was sitting at the central prep counter with her head resting on her folded arms. She did not startle when the door opened. She simply lifted her head and looked at the child standing in her kitchen with a tomato in both hands, with the flat, unreadable expression of someone who had run out of the energy required for reactions. The girl held the tomato out. She said, because she was 7 and had not yet learned to bracket her honesty, that she had grown this herself and that it was very good and that she thought the woman should have it. The woman looked at the tomato, then at the child. She said, without cruelty but without softness either, that she couldn't taste anything, hadn't been able to for 2 years, that the tomato was wasted here. The girl considered this information with the seriousness it deserved. She did not leave. She held the tomato a little more securely, as though she'd decided it needed protecting, and she closed her eyes the way she did when she was concentrating on something difficult. Then she bit into it, and she described what happened. She said it made a sound like a dry branch snapping underfoot, that initial resistance and then the sudden give, the way something breaks when it's ready to break. She said the color of it was the color of late afternoon in September, the specific orange-red that the sky goes when it can't decide whether it's finished with the day yet. She said if it were a sound, it would be something percussion, not loud, not soft, the middle sound that a thing makes when it is exactly what it is. She held it out again. She said, "You don't have to taste it, just hold it." The woman did not move for a moment. She looked at the tomato. Then she looked away. at the wall, at the sealed surface of the counter, at anything else. The girl waited with the patience of someone who has not yet learned that waiting is supposed to be uncomfortable. The thing was, every person who had tried to help her in 2 years had known what they were doing. Doctors, colleagues, the friends who still called occasionally. They all came carrying the knowledge of what she had lost, and that knowledge lived in their eyes, whether they meant it to or not. A careful adjustment, a softness that was really just pity wearing better clothes. This child did not know enough to be careful. She was simply holding out a tomato because it was good, and she had grown it herself, and she thought someone else should have it. There was no strategy in it, no awareness of what it cost to receive. The woman reached out and took it. She held it in both hands. She didn't eat it. She just held it, feeling the weight of it, the warmth the sun had left behind in its skin, the slight give of something perfectly ripe. The girl sat down on the floor of the kitchen with her back against the cabinet, pulled her sketchbook from under her arm, and began to draw. She did not ask permission. She did not explain herself. She simply settled in with the ease of a child who has decided she belongs somewhere and is waiting for the location to catch up with the decision. The woman looked at the tomato in her hands for a long time. When she finally set it down on the counter beside her, she did not put it at the edge. She placed it in the center. 3 days later, the woman began closing herself off again. It happened gradually, the way weather changes. Not a sudden shift, but a slow pulling in, a series of small withdrawals that accumulated into distance. She stopped appearing at the kitchen door in the mornings. The lights in the main house began going off earlier. The bin outside the service entrance had 3 new cans in it by Wednesday. The girl noticed. She did not mention it to her father, but on Thursday evening, after he had come in from the garden and was washing up, and she had nominally been sent to her room to get ready for bed, she went to the kitchen instead and found the end of a small loaf her father had bought in the village the day before. She cut a piece, slightly uneven because she was 7 and knife skills are developed, not innate, and wrapped it in a cloth the way she had watched her father wrap things when he wanted to keep them warm. She walked to the main house in the dark. She set the bread on the step outside the woman's bedroom door. She did not knock. She did not leave a note. She simply placed it there and walked back down the hall and out into the night. Her father was standing in the doorway of the cottage when she came back across the gravel. He had seen her go. He had waited rather than following, which was a decision he made quickly and instinctively and felt certain about only afterward. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said she wasn't hungry and went inside to wash her teeth. He stood in the doorway for another moment, looking across the dark garden toward the main house. He had spent 2 years trying to figure out what to do with grief, his own, his daughter's, the grief that lived in rooms and in the smell of certain flowers and in the particular angle of afternoon light through a window. He had read things and tried things and sat with things, and none of it had taught him what watching his daughter walk across a dark garden with a piece of bread had just taught him. That care doesn't always wait for permission, that sometimes the kindest thing is simply to place something warm where someone might find it and walk away before they feel obligated to respond. He went back inside. In the morning, the cloth was folded neatly on the step. The bread was gone. She tried once more 2 days later, not with food this time, just herself. She walked to the main house in the afternoon and knocked on the bedroom door directly, the way she knocked on her father's door when she wanted to tell him something. The door opened. The woman looked at her. The girl held out nothing, said nothing, had brought nothing. She had simply come. The woman looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who has used up the portion of themselves available for this today. Then she closed the door quietly, not a slam, just a close. The girl walked back across the garden. Her father was at the trellis and had seen the whole thing. He waited. She came and stood beside him. She said, "It didn't work this time." He set down what he was holding. He said, "Sometimes people need to receive something without having to be present for the giving. If you hand it to them directly, they have to decide in that moment whether they're ready. Most of the time, they're not." She thought about this seriously. the way she thought about most things. Then she said, "So the bread was better because she could pretend she just found it." He said, "Something like that." She nodded slowly. She picked up a trowel and began helping him without being asked, and neither of them said anything more about it. The envelope arrived on a Friday. He saw it on the kitchen table when he came in to make lunch. A cream-colored envelope, good paper, the kind of weight that signals intent. He didn't touch it. It wasn't his to touch. He made his daughter's lunch and left it covered on the counter and took his own outside and said nothing. By evening, he knew something had shifted in the main house. Not from anything visible. The curtains were the same. The lights came on at the same time. The bin had not been moved. But there is a quality that certain kinds of silence have when they are covering something active. Something loud and ongoing happening just underneath the surface. He had lived inside that kind of silence for 14 months after his wife died. He recognized it the way you recognize a sound you've heard in a room before. He gave it until the following morning. Then he went to the main house. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing, but the silence on the other side of the door had the particular density of presence rather than absence, and he knew she was there. He tried the handle. It opened. He found her sitting on the floor of the darkened bedroom, back against the wall below the window, knees pulled up, the cream envelope open on the floor beside her with its contents spread out. She had not eaten. He could tell from the stillness of the kitchen as he'd passed through it. He did not know how long she had been sitting here, but her face had the particular flatness of someone who has been in one position long enough for the body to stop registering it. He went to the kitchen. He did not deliberate over what to make. There was no time for deliberation, and besides, there was only one thing he knew how to make from memory, completely, without thinking. His wife's recipe. A simple leek broth, the one she had made in winter when he was tired or sick or struggling, the one she had made without being asked because she had understood something he hadn't always said aloud. He had not made it since she died. He hadn't been able to. The memory of it was too close to the surface of the thing, too saturated, too present. But here, now, in this kitchen, with his hands finding the familiar sequence of steps without consulting anything except his own muscle memory, it felt less like grief and more like inheritance. Something passed forward. He carried the bowl into the bedroom. She looked at it. She said what he already knew, that she couldn't taste it, that it was pointless. He said, "Hold it." She didn't move. He crossed the room, sat on the floor at a respectful distance, and held the bowl out until she finally, slowly, reached for it. The ceramic was warm, properly warm, the kind that holds its heat, that you feel in your palms and up into your wrists. He watched her hands close around it. He watched something cross her face, not happiness, not relief, something more fundamental than either, the simple animal fact of warmth. He said, "You've been starving something that isn't your stomach." She didn't answer, but she held the bowl, and in the hallway, very quietly, his daughter settled herself against the wall outside the door, not eavesdropping, just nearby, the way she was always nearby when something important was happening, and waited. That evening, after the woman had finally eaten something, and he had washed the bowl in her kitchen and left quietly with his daughter, he sat at the small desk in the cottage to write in the notebook he kept for work. Observations about the garden, notes on soil composition, schedules for replanting. His daughter was supposed to be asleep. She came padding out in her socks and went to his bag, not sneakily, just directly, the way she did most things, and began looking for the coil of garden twine she'd asked about earlier. She found the seed packet. He had been carrying it for 11 months. It had come with him from the apartment to a friend's house to here, always in the same outer pocket of the same canvas bag, worn at the corners and soft from handling. He had never planted what was inside it. He had never thrown it away. She held it up. She asked in the matter-of-fact tone she used for questions she had been saving up, why they had never grown these. She said she'd seen pictures. She said they were beautiful. He sat very still at the desk. She looked at him, patient, waiting, holding the seed packet with the same easy care she gave to all growing things. He reached across and took it from her gently. He held it for a moment, the soft, worn paper, the faint crinkle of it in his hands. He could feel the small, hard seeds shifting inside when he tilted it. He had avoided touching it for 11 months, and now he was holding it in a lamp-lit cottage room with his daughter watching him with clear, uncomplicated eyes, and it was not as impossible as he had thought it would be. He didn't open the desk drawer where he kept the tools and packets and small organized categories of his working life. He opened the drawer on the left, the one beside the bed, the one with no particular purpose, the one that just held things he wasn't ready to deal with yet. He put the packet inside. He closed the drawer. His daughter watched this without comment. Then she found the twine, held it up in quiet triumph, and went back to her room. He sat at the desk for a while longer in the quiet. Through the window he could see the main house. One light was still on, the kitchen window, faint and yellow against the dark. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened his notebook and began to write. He did not write for long. After a while, he closed the notebook, went to the drawer beside the bed, and took the seed packet out again. He stood in the small lamp-lit room holding it, listening to his daughter's breathing from down the hall. He put on his jacket. He went outside. The garden was dark and still wet from the day's rain, the soil soft underfoot, the air carrying the particular cold clarity of a night that is finished with its weather. He walked to the bed along the southern wall, the one with the best drainage, the right exposure, the soil he had spent 3 weeks correcting. He stood in front of it with the seed packet in his hand. He stood there for a long time. Then he put the packet back in his jacket pocket and went inside. He did not go back to the notebook. He turned off the lamp and lay down in the dark, and somewhere in the main house a single light was still on, and he looked at it through the window for a while before it finally went out. She asked him on a Wednesday morning, which felt significant only in retrospect. He was staking a young climbing plant along the trellis he had rebuilt at the eastern wall. Patient, methodical work, the kind that requires both hands and most of your attention. When she appeared at the garden gate, she stood there for a moment without speaking, which was unusual. She generally said whatever she intended to say within 3 seconds of appearing anywhere. The pause told him something was costing her. She said, "I need someone to taste things." He looked at her. He waited. She said it the way someone states a logistical problem, not a request exactly, more an identification of a deficit that required filling. She was going back into the kitchen. She needed a palette she could borrow. She was asking if he would do it. He set down the ties he'd been working with. He looked at his hands for a moment, soiled dark in the creases of his knuckles, then back at her. He said yes. The kitchen was different when it was occupied by purpose. He noticed it as soon as he stepped inside. Something in the air, the particular charge of a space that has been asked to function again after a long dormancy. She had opened 2 of the windows, which she had not done since he'd arrived. The afternoon light came through at an angle that caught the copper pots and returned a version of their former warmth. She had laid out ingredients on the central counter with the precise, considered arrangement of someone who has been planning this in their head for longer than they're willing to admit. She moved through the space with a kind of muscle memory that was both impressive and painful to watch. Reaching for things without looking, adjusting the flame by sound and not by sight. Handling the knife with a fluency that made it clear this was not a skill she had learned, but a language she had been born into. And underneath all of it, quietly, the effort of someone performing a beloved activity from which the primary sense has been removed. Like a musician playing in a soundproofed room. She made the first sauce. It took 20 minutes. She brought him a spoon. He tasted it. He gave her his honest assessment, the only kind of assessment he knew how to give, in the language available to him, which was the language of a scientist, precise and structural. He identified the acid component, the slight imbalance at the finish, the gap where sweetness needed to enter to complete the architecture of the thing. He watched her face as he spoke. She had been prepared to receive information. She had not been prepared for that specific kind of information. Accurate, yes. Technically correct, yes, but delivered without any of the sensory intuition that turns correct into right. He had described her sauce the way a person describes a painting they've only read about. She put the spoon down on the counter and did not move for a moment. Then she started crying. Not softly, not with the contained private grief he'd occasionally witnessed through the kitchen window over the past weeks. She cried the way people cry when they've been holding something for so long that the muscles responsible for holding finally give out. Suddenly, completely, with a sound that seemed to surprise even her. He didn't cross the kitchen. He didn't reach for her. He stood where he was and waited, because some things need the space they need, and reducing that space, even with good intentions, is still a reduction. After a while, she said, "I'm not crying because of the sauce." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm trying to rebuild something, and I've forgotten what it was for." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, and it came out more plainly than he'd intended, the way truth does when you're tired of carrying it carefully, that he had stopped growing something he loved because it reminded him of loss, that he had told himself it was grief, that he was starting to understand it had also been cowardice. She looked at him across the kitchen. He said, "We have both confused mourning with avoidance. They feel similar. They are not the same." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. Not the silence of people avoiding each other, the silence of people arriving, separately and by different routes, at the same honest place. His daughter was sitting in the corner of the kitchen, where she had been since they'd come in, settled on the floor with her sketchbook, drawing with the steady concentration of someone engaged in important work, apparently oblivious to everything happening above her head. She lifted her sketchbook without being asked. She held it up. She had drawn 3 figures sitting at a table. The figures were rough and slightly disproportionate in the way of a 7-year-old's drawings. Large heads, small bodies, hands that were more mitten than hand. But they were unmistakably 3 people, unmistakably at a table together, and there was something in the composition, in the way the 3 shapes leaned slightly toward a common center, that was more accurate than it had any right to be. Nobody spoke. The tension in the kitchen, the accumulated weight of the argument, the tears, the competing vulnerabilities laid out on the counter alongside the unfinished sauce, quietly, unexpectedly, lost its charge. Like weather that has decided it's finished. The storm came without much warning, the way the worst ones do. He had checked the sky at 6 in the evening and found it ambiguous. Heavy at the edges, the particular yellow-gray that could mean something or nothing, the color of a day that hadn't decided yet. By 9 o'clock, it had decided. The wind came first, moving through the vineyard rows with a sound like something being dragged across a long surface. And then the rain arrived in the manner of something that had been waiting a long time and was not interested in being gradual about it. He was out of bed and pulling on his jacket before he was fully awake, because the garden was in his mind the way important things are in your mind, immediately accessible, no warm-up required. He had spent 6 weeks rebuilding those beds. The seedlings his daughter had tended with the daily focused attention of someone who understood, at 7, that growing things require the same consistency as love. Those seedlings were in direct exposure. He took the torch from the shelf and went out into it. His daughter, he discovered 40 seconds later, had already beaten him there. She was in the garden in her raincoat and her rubber boots, her torch tucked under her arm, both hands working to cover the most vulnerable of the seedling beds with the emergency row covers he kept folded in the shed. She had found them herself, in the dark, in a shed she'd only entered a handful of times. He worked beside her without comment. They moved through the garden with the practiced efficiency of people who know each other's rhythms. He taking the heavier work, she filling in the spaces he couldn't reach without disturbing something else. Both of them navigating by torchlight through wind and rain that made every simple action require twice the effort. He did not notice the main house door open. He noticed her when she was already in the garden. She was wearing the dark coat she wore for everything, which was not a raincoat, and she had come out without a torch. She crossed to the bed that her father and daughter were not covering, the one that held the vegetables his daughter had specifically designated for harvest, the one that had been tended with the most particular care. She dropped to her knees in the mud beside it without hesitation and began working with her hands. She had good hands. He had noticed this before in the kitchen. The efficiency of them, the precision. In the garden, in the dark, in the rain, they were no less capable. She worked quickly and without instruction, covering and securing with the intuitive logic of someone whose hands knew how to solve problems even when the rest of them was uncertain. The greenhouse panel went with a sound like a gunshot. The central support, one of the older ones he had been meaning to reinforce and had not yet gotten to, buckled under the combined weight of water and wind and gave way with a crash that sent both he and his daughter stumbling backward. He caught her. The panel came down across the edge of the path, missing all three of them by a distance he preferred not to calculate. The rain was coming harder now. The torchlight was failing. He made the decision quickly. They could not save everything, and the three of them standing in a collapsing greenhouse in a storm were a more urgent problem than the plants. He took his daughter's hand. He turned toward the main house, and without discussion, without any explicit offer or acceptance, the woman came with them. The power went out at the same moment they came through the kitchen door. The three of them stood in the sudden dark, soaking, breathing hard, the sound of the storm continuing its argument with the world outside. His daughter had lost one of her boots somewhere in the last 20 feet. The woman's coat was shedding water steadily onto the flagstone floor. He found the candles in the drawer he'd identified, weeks ago, as the emergency drawer, the one holding all the things a house keeps for when ordinary systems fail. He lit 3 of them. The kitchen returned in warm, unsteady shapes. He looked at the woman. Her hair was wet. Her face, in the candlelight, had lost the particular controlled blankness she maintained during daylight hours. Stripped back, the way people look when external conditions have overtaken the energy required for performance. She looked tired. She looked cold. She looked, he thought, more honestly herself than he had ever seen her. His daughter was already sitting on the kitchen floor, pulling off her remaining boot, with the practical efficiency of a child who considers being wet a logistical problem rather than a catastrophe. He looked at what was available in the kitchen, what remained from the afternoon's attempt, the ingredients still on the counter, the vegetables they had managed to bring in before the storm made the garden untenable. He did not consult anyone. He simply began. He did not pretend to be a cook. He knew this about himself clearly and without false modesty. What he knew how to do was follow the logic of things, the logic of how flavors built on each other, the patient sequencing that his wife had explained to him over many years in many kitchens, not as instruction, but as conversation. He had absorbed more than he'd realized. He understood, at minimum, that heat and time and the quality of the original ingredient were doing most of the work, and that his primary job was not to interfere with them unnecessarily. He worked in the candlelight. The storm continued outside. His daughter had found a blanket from somewhere and wrapped herself in it and was sitting at the kitchen table, watching with the alert, interested attention she brought to anything that seemed important. The woman sat at the counter. She said nothing, but she did not leave the kitchen, which he understood, by now, to be its own kind of statement. At some point, he couldn't have said exactly when, she stood and moved beside him. She did not take over. She adjusted. A small correction to the heat, a handful of something dried and aromatic added at a moment he wouldn't have known to choose. Her hands working beside his, with the precise economy of a person who has done this 10,000 times. Even if the doing was now incomplete, even if the final confirmation was no longer available to her. They did not speak while they worked. The meal that came out of it was not a Michelin-starred construction. It was not elegant or refined or composed with the geometric certainty of her former work. It was a rough, warm thing, a stew of battered vegetables and good stock, and the instincts of 2 people who were each, in their separate ways, learning to cook from memory. He set it on the table. 3 bowls, the candles between them, the storm outside still insisting on itself. His daughter took the first bite with the frank, unpolitical honesty of a child who has not learned to moderate her immediate responses. Her face said everything. He tasted it. He looked across the table. He said, "It tastes like something being rebuilt." The woman held her spoon above her bowl. She lowered it. She ate. She could not taste the salt or the sweetness or the particular depth that the time had given the broth. But the warmth of it moved through her in the way that warmth does, indiscriminate, generous, requiring nothing from the body except its willingness to receive. She set her spoon down after a moment. She looked at the bowl, then at the two people across the table from her, then at the kitchen around her, the copper pots throwing back the candlelight, the windows dark with rain, the surfaces that had been sealed and empty for 2 years now occupied by the ordinary evidence of a meal having been made. She did not cry. She had already cried everything available to her today in the afternoon kitchen with the failed sauce and the honest words and the 7-year-old's drawing of 3 people at a table. Instead, she picked up her spoon again, and she finished her meal. Spring arrived the way it always does, not announcing itself, but simply becoming undeniable, the way certain truths do. The damage from the storm had been substantial, and in the end, clarifying. Several of the oldest beds were beyond recovery. He replanted them with varieties better suited to the exposure, better adapted to the particular character of this soil and this light. The greenhouse was rebuilt with materials he sourced himself. The new panels set in frames he'd reinforced properly this time. The vineyard rows, which he'd been uncertain about when he arrived, had come through largely intact. They had deep roots, which helped, the way deep roots always help. His daughter was in the garden every morning before he was. He would come out at first light to find her already there, crouched over one bed or another, checking, adjusting, talking to things in the quiet, one-sided way she'd apparently always talked to plants, which he'd only recently noticed. She had begun keeping her own notebook, imitating the form of his without the terminology, recording observations in a 7-year-old's handwriting alongside small, detailed drawings that were getting more precise every week. The woman came out some mornings now. Not every morning, not with any announcement or commitment. Just sometimes, when the light was right, she would appear at the kitchen door with her coffee and stand at the edge of the garden, watching for a while before going back inside. Occasionally, she crouched beside his daughter at one of the beds, and he would see them together. The woman pointing at something, his daughter explaining something back with the authority of a person who has decided she knows what she's doing, and he would continue with his own work and leave them to theirs. The kitchen window was open most days now. One morning, early, the light still low and golden, the estate quiet in the specific way of places that have not yet remembered they have the whole day ahead of them, he went to the drawer beside the bed. He took out the seed packet. He carried it outside. He found a section of bed near the southern wall, sheltered and well-drained, the soil exactly right. He crouched down and prepared the ground with his hands, working carefully, the way he worked with anything he intended to last. He planted the seeds, one by one. He covered them. He pressed the soil gently flat. He sat back on his heels and looked at the unmarked bed for a moment. It looked like nothing yet. That was the nature of seeds. They committed to themselves entirely while showing you nothing, and you had to trust the process, which was another way of saying you had to trust that what you had put in was real, and that the conditions were right, and that time would do its portion of the work. He stood. He went back inside. At breakfast, his daughter asked him what he'd planted in the new bed. He told her. He watched her face arrange itself into the specific delight she reserved for information that confirmed something she'd already hoped was true. She asked if she could water them. He said yes. The dinner was her idea. She proposed it practically, without ceremony, in the same flat declarative register she used for everything. Standing in the kitchen doorway one evening, telling him that she intended to cook on Saturday, that she would need his assistance as a tasting reference, that his daughter was welcome if she wanted to come. She said it the way she might report a change in the weather, and went back inside before he could respond. He told his daughter. His daughter's response was to immediately begin drawing a seating arrangement. Saturday came. The table was set in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, which remained closed and would perhaps remain closed indefinitely, which was fine. The kitchen table, The one they had sat at in the dark with the storm outside and the candles between them. The one that had started meaning something before any of them had agreed it should. She cooked for 3 hours. He was present for all of it, tasting when asked, describing as accurately as he could, learning as he went that there was a vocabulary available beyond the botanical and the scientific, that flavor had a language adjacent to the language of growing things if you were willing to find the connections. He got better at it as the hours went on. She got better at translating his descriptions into adjustments. Between them, they developed something that was not a system exactly, more a dialect, specific to the two of them, functional in a way that neither could have arrived at alone. His daughter sat at the table and drew everything. When the food came out, it was not perfect. She said so herself, plainly, before anyone tasted it, identifying the specific elements that had not done exactly what she'd intended, naming the gap between what it was and what it would have been 2 years ago, with her full capacity available to her. She said it without apology and without self-pity, just as information, a current assessment of where things stood. He tasted everything. He told her what he found, honestly, and what he found was that it was very good, not in the way of something attempting its former heights, but in the way of something that had been made by hands that knew what they were doing, with attention that was genuine for people who were actually there. His daughter tasted everything and said each thing was her favorite. They ate. The kitchen held the warmth of a room that has been used for its proper purpose. When the meal was finished, the woman stood and began clearing the table. Not because it needed doing immediately, just because her hands knew what came after a meal and had decided to remember. The girl stood up without being asked and carried her own bowl to the sink, then came back for the bread plate, then the serving dish, moving between the table and the counter with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided she lives here now, at least for this evening, at least for this. The man sat at the table a moment longer. He watched the two of them moving through the kitchen, the woman who had sealed this room for 2 years, the child who had walked into it uninvited with a lopsided tomato, doing the most ordinary thing a kitchen can hold. He picked up his bowl. He carried it in. Outside, the bed along the southern wall held its dark and patient quiet. Underground, in the particular darkness that seeds know before anyone else does, something had already begun. Nobody knew yet. That was fine. It would show itself when it was ready.